Putin has gained three benefits from the war in the Middle East. What exactly are they? Let's talk about this and more with our guest, David Tafuri, international lawyer and former US State Department official. Now, with us today, David, I'm glad to see you and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me again.
David, U.S. Secretary of State Mark Rubio stated that the operation in Iran was necessary because within a year to a year and a half, Iran would have crossed the immunity threshold, meaning it would possess so many short-range missiles and drones that no one could effectively counter them. He warned that they could have taken the entire world hostage. To what extent was the U.S. strike a preemptive measure versus a strategic escalation? What conclusions can we draw? What is happening now?
Well, I think Secretary Rubio makes a good point. I haven't seen the same data that he is relying upon for that, but we know anecdotally that Iran was producing a lot of drones and a lot of missiles, and its ballistic missiles technology was improving and they were increasing the range of their ballistic missiles. So this certainly was a danger, not just to Iran's neighbors, not just to the United States, but to the world, because Iran is a pariah state and often supports terrorism, often supports violence against other countries, seeks to destabilize other countries in the region. So allowing them to improve militarily in that manner would be a global threat.
And yes, President Donald Trump said that his country possesses virtually unlimited stockpiles of weapons, allowing Washington to wage wars indefinitely. However, the Wall Street Journal reports that U.S. stocks of precision munitions and interceptor missiles are rapidly decreasing. How sustainable is the notion of virtually unlimited U.S. stockpiles in light of reports on declining precision munitions? What do you think about this?
Well, I read that Truth Social post by President Trump this morning, and I honestly found it a little bit confusing because he talked about there being unlimited stockpiles of munitions that the U.S. has, but then he complained about President Biden providing a lot of these weapons to Ukraine, even though most people in America supported the provision of weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. So this seemed a bit contradictory in his message, so I'm not exactly sure what he's talking about there, but it's clear that the U.S. defense companies need to ramp up their production. Even if we do have sufficient munitions and sufficient missiles and stockpiles of the weapons that we need, we are depleting them, and it is likely that there will be more kinetic activities that the U.S. is involved in as a result of the actions in Iran and Venezuela. And so I think it's very important that the U.S. Arms itself, and that requires the defense companies in America that produce a lot of these weapons to start new production lines in order to meet the demand.
And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky proposed sending Ukrainians' top drone interception experts to the Middle East. Now, if regional leaders can convince Vladimir Putin to agree to a one-month ceasefire in Russia's war against Ukraine, could Ukrainian involvement in the Middle East affect the balance of support from Western allies for Ukraine itself?
First of all, it's no secret that Ukraine is now the leading country in the world for drone technology and for having developed tactical drones that are effective on the battlefield and that are tested on the battlefield. And of course, Ukraine also has a lot of personnel who are very experienced in operating drones, in manufacturing drones. It's created its own domestic production capacity inside Ukraine. And so the offer by President Zelensky is one that would be tempting for the U.S. and for the other countries that are under attack from Iran. And keep in mind that Ukraine is especially skilled at countering Shahid drones, which are manufactured by Iran, provided to Russia, but now Iran is also using them against their foes. And so I think this is a really nice offer. I'm not sure that the U.S. and other countries that could be recipients will take Ukraine up on it, but they should seriously consider it.
In Europe, there are concerns that Trump may lose interest in Ukraine amid the conflict with Iran. U.S. operations in the Middle East have become a Pentagon and White House priority, potentially pushing the Ukrainian issue to the back burner. How likely is it that U.S. attention to the Middle East will significantly delay weapons deliveries to Ukraine? Are European fears of U.S. Disengagement from Ukraine justified or exaggerated?
Well, even before the action against Iran by the United States, Europe had to have recognized that it needs to be ready to support Ukraine on its own. The U.S. is already no longer providing weapons for free and no longer providing financial assistance to support Ukraine. Trump cut all of that off. He is allowing the purchase of American-made weapons by Europe and by Ukraine to support Ukraine, but he might cut that off too, and Europe has to be ready for that. So I do think that the current situation with Iran is distracting the Trump administration away from the crisis in Ukraine, and that's going to take away their attention. It's also going to perhaps cause them to divert some of the resources that could have gone to Ukraine to the fight with Iran. But it's also important to note that Iran was one of Russia's and is one of Russia's closest allies. So the actions against Iran in that manner actually will hurt Russia. Russia was relying on Iran for some of the drones and drone technology, and it was relying on Iran for other things and for oil. And so maybe not for oil, but for other things. And so I think the actions against Iran actually will weaken Russia, and because Russia doesn't have that many allies, Iran is one of its strongest.
In light of the fall of the regimes of former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and Nicolas Maduro, how significant a blow is this following the events in Syria and Venezuela for Russia or for Putin's global status and prestige?
Well, it's a really good point. I mean, Russia is losing its best friends. It lost Syria over a year ago when the Assad government fell, and Venezuela more recently when Maduro was removed and with the blockade by the U.S. on Venezuela, and now Iran, under threat of potential regime change. If there was a regime change and there was a movement towards democracy in Iran, you can bet that Iran would no longer be an ally and close friend of Russia. So in that way, Putin should feel threatened. I mean, what does he have left? He has this alliance with China, but China isn't providing a lot of weapons support to Russia. It isn't providing any personnel to assist Russia with its illegal war in Ukraine. So Russia just has Belarus and North Korea, maybe a few other countries that are supporting it and assisting it. It's really isolated at this point.
So we understand that this development undermines Russia's credibility as a geopolitical actor, but over 20% of global oil and gas exports pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Following the outbreak of hostilities, Iran ordered certain vessels to change course and threatened attacks. A complete closure of the strait could trigger a sharp surge in energy prices. For Russia, where oil and gas account for about 45% of the federal budget, higher commodity prices mean additional revenue, in particular to finance the war against Ukraine. In other words, is Putin benefiting from this?
At least in the short term, he could benefit there's already been an increase in oil prices. And so it may be able to sell its oil for a higher price were it not for the actions in Iran. But it's ultimately very important to the U.S. and many of its allies to ensure that the Strait of Hormuz is navigable and that ships can pass through it. And I imagine, given the overwhelming advantage that the U.S. has in terms of its Navy versus the naval forces of Iran, that the U.S. will be able to keep that open ultimately. And so there should not, in the long term, be a significant change, and it should be possible for the U.S. and its allies to ensure that oil and gas prices stay low so that Russia doesn't increase its revenues.
Another potential benefit is arms trade. Even during active hostilities, Iran agreed to purchase 500 Verbal launchers and 2,500 surface-to-air missiles from Russia. Russia has been Iran's Iran's main arms supplier since 1979, accounting for 1/3 of all Iranian weapons imports. Every sale brings additional revenue to the Kremlin. Does this arms deal materially benefit Russia's strategic position, in your opinion?
Well, I think anything that helps Iran benefits Russia. And of course, also, if Iran is able to pay for weapons from Russia as it was before these actions, then that also increases the revenue for Russia, and just the provision of weapons and transferring weapons back and forth increases the level of cooperation between the Russian military and the Iranian military. But given the situation now with Iran, I would say good luck to Russia being able to make a shipment into Iran. I would expect that the U.S. is paying very close attention to what Russia is doing to support Iran, and it would stop any ships that were intended to deliver weapons to Iran. So I think it'd be very hard for Russia to fulfill an order for weapons from Iran, at least right now.
And again, regarding U.S. stockpiles, the third advantage for Russia is depletion of American stockpiles. Combat operations against Iran require a large number of PAC-3 Patriot interceptors, which the U.S. also uses to shut down Russian Shahed drones. The more these weapons are used in the Middle East, the fewer remain available for Ukraine. What are the potential risks for Ukraine?
Well, it's a big risk for Ukraine, but honestly, I think Ukraine and the Ukrainian government got the message well before this operation against Iran that they needed to be ready to continue to fight Russia and defend themselves without the support of the U.S., without U.S.-made weapons. Hopefully, the U.S. can still provide some weapons to Ukraine, but Europe and Ukraine need to be ready to fight this war without the U.S., at least while President Trump is president, because he's not been a reliable supporter of Ukraine. He'd like to see the war between Russia and Ukraine stop, and he's made an effort to try to mediate a ceasefire, but he's been much less active in terms of providing financial support or weapons to Ukraine. And that began at the very beginning of his administration. And I expect that will continue through his administration, especially as the U.S. Focuses on other places like Iran.
And you mentioned China. China has called on all parties involved in the Iran conflict to ensure the safe passage of vessels through the Strait of Hormuz, representing a direct appeal from Iran's main economic partner to maintain trade through this vital waterway. How effective is China's call likely to be in ensuring the safe passage of vessels through the Strait of Hormuz? Does this statement signal a growing strategic influence of China in the Middle Eastern maritime security, for example?
Well, I think it's important to note that, China is not, taking any harsh actions or retaliatory actions against the U.S. for its operation against Iran. It has expressed an interest in making sure that the Strait of Hormuz is navigable and that its ships can pass and it can continue to receive oil from the Middle East. And that's important to China because they get a lot of their oil from the Middle East, especially from Iran. But, if things go as President Trump and the Trump administration want them to go, it may be hard for China to continue to buy oil from Iran. And China is probably already looking at alternative sources for oil and for the resources that it needs, given that the jeopardy that Iran is in right now.
And China views an attempt to connect its actions concerning Taiwan with the US-Israel strikes on Iran as unacceptable, according to Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning. The question arises whether China might exploit US preoccupation in the Middle East to escalate its activities related to Taiwan. How do you think, could Beijing take advantage of Washington's focus on the Middle East to intensify pressure or operations on Taiwan? Your own opinion.
I think it's possible. I think it would be likely harder for the U.S. to respond to aggressive action by China toward Taiwan at this time when so much attention and so many resources are focused on Iran and on the Middle East and on protecting our Middle Eastern allies that are being attacked by Iran. But China can't be sure that the U.S. wouldn't move some of those assets very quickly to the South China Sea in order to protect Taiwan. And the U.S. has been pretty clear across presidential administrations that it very well may defend Taiwan if invaded. And a lesson for China is how hard it has been for Russia to invade Ukraine and how much the Russian army has lost, even though it's a much larger army. It had much greater resources. Ukraine has demonstrated that a smaller country can defend itself, especially if it has modern weapons and technology and resilience. And I expect the Taiwanese would fight very hard to defend themselves, just as the Ukrainians have.
And David, more about Donald Trump. How is the war in the Middle East affecting Trump's approval rating? Why could the conflict with Iran determine the future of the U.S. president?
Yeah, I think it's too early to tell how his decision to attack Iran will impact his favorability. I think it depends a lot on how the operation goes. They've made, very ambitious claims about Iran. President Trump is now talking about regime change. It may be hard to accomplish regime change without putting U.S. boots on the ground. President Trump has said in the past he's not going to put U.S. troops in Iran. But if the goal for the Trump administration is to get rid of the Iranian regime and to help Iran transition to democracy, which is what is the aspiration of most Iranian people, the U.S. may need to get more involved than the Trump administration expects right now. Well, if Iran mounts an effective insurgency like Iraq did after the 2003 invasion, there could be concern by Americans about President Trump's decision to go forward with Iran. Many people in the United States, while recognizing the threat that Iran is, believe that the U.S. should have focused more on negotiations and trying to get a nuclear deal. We had a nuclear deal in 2015 that was negotiated by President Obama. The Trump administration and President Trump was critical of it when he took over in his first term. He ripped it up in 2018, but there are still those who think that that was a mistake because although it wasn't the best nuclear deal, Iran was essentially complying with it and it was allowing inspections. So all of this has to be in the minds of the American people as they evaluate the decision by the United States to invade Iran or to attack Iran.
So, as I understand, most Americans currently do not support the war with Iran, worry about escalation and high cost, and many believe Trump has been too quick to use force.
Well, I haven't seen the latest polling, and I'm not sure there's any reliable polling yet because this action is just a few days old. But I think American people are paying close attention to the losses that the U.S. is suffering. So far, they've been pretty minimal, but we've had 4 American soldiers killed, at least 4, and there have been some other injuries among American soldiers. We've lost at least 3 fighter jets. And President Trump has warned the American people, I think wisely, that there are going to be more losses. There's going to be more loss of life on the American side. And I think Americans will be attuned to that and focusing very closely on what are the costs of this decision to attack Iran.
So we are closely observing the entire situation. Mr. Tafuri, thank you so much for this important and interesting, as always, conversation. Thanks for supporting Ukraine and Ukrainian people. David Tafuri, international lawyer and former US State Department official, was with us today. Please share this interview and continue supporting Ukraine. I wish you all the best and see you.
Дякую. Слава Україні.
Героям слава.